Everyone. Since we are working with a graphic novel that's an adaptation of a piece of classic literature, I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about literary adaptation in general and some of the things that you might want to consider when you're working with an adapted text. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about literary adaptation? Essentially, what an adaptation is the translation of one piece of literature into another format, another modality, or another form. And this can mean a lot of different things, but let's talk about some common examples. So a lot of times you will see popular books being adapted into film. I feel like that's probably one of the most common adaptations we see in pop culture. So for example, the Hunger Games novels being adapted into films is a classic example of that. We can also see other types of media other than, stories, short stories or novels being adapted into other formats. Fallout, I think, is a great example of this. The television show is adapted from the video game. And then finally, sometimes you'll have outliers where types of media that you might not expect lending themselves to adaptation do get adapted into a different format. For example, the poem Oxcart Man by Donald Hall was adapted by the author into a children's book. So these are some examples just to give you a foundational understanding of how adaptation works in literature. So why do we adapt content? Why do creators take something that already exists and reimagine it as something else? So these are sort of a sampling of reasons why creators do this. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but I think it will give us some food for thought as we consider how we engage with adapted literature, such as our graphic novel. So sometimes creators like to create modern reimaginings of historical texts. For example, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet takes, a Shakespearean text and puts it in the context of the late 20th century. Sometimes people like to use adaptations to revise what happens in the text. For example, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies takes an opportunity to include new content within the text to create a completely different story. Sometimes adaptations are born out of the popularity of the original piece of media. I think that we see this very often with text to film adaptations rather. But I think we're starting to see it a lot with video games as well. Popular video games are more frequently now getting film or television show adaptations, which is interesting. Sometimes someone will adapt a text that is particularly maybe difficult for a general audience or maybe is dated into a more accessible format. I think that we see this a lot with graphic novels. Creators will take a text like the Odyssey that requires a lot of work to process, and they reimagine it perhaps in a graphic novel format or a different format that makes the content easier to understand and easier to navigate. And then finally, sometimes authors have a completely different vision for a piece of literature, and they want to create their own version of it. This is often controversial. With adaptations, a lot of people who love the original piece of media want the adaptation to be more or less in alignment with the original version. Situations where we've seen this kind of adaptation include The Killing Joke, which is an adaptation or an animated film adaptation of the graphic novel The Killing Joke, which is a Batman storyline. There's significant changes between the book and the film, and fans were not necessarily particularly pleased with that. I think that these types of adaptations can be interesting, but they are often kind of contested. So, now that we've talked a little bit about literary adaptations, I want you to think specifically about our adapted text. Why adapt a classic text? Why take sort of one of those pieces of literature that's part of the so-called canon and adapt it into something like a graphic novel? And this isn't something I expect you to respond to in an assignment or anything like that, but I would like you to have this in mind as one of your interpretive focal points as we work through this text. So I hope this has given you a little bit of background to work with as we move forward with this graphic novel, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on this text, not just in terms of adaptation, but in terms of the variety of different features that it presents us with.